I always believed my life would remain simple, quietly tucked away at the forest's edge where the world felt both impossibly vast and beautifully small, and where the rhythm of each day passed like the turning of soft pages in a worn book I never expected anyone else to read, let alone rewrite. Most mornings began before the sun had fully risen, when the sky still hovered in that fragile place between indigo and gold, and I would sit on the creaking wooden steps of my cabin with my hands wrapped around a warm mug, letting the steam brush against my face as if reminding me I was still here, still breathing, still moving forward even when life felt paused. The forest would greet me with its usual choruses, birds chirping, branches shifting, the distant stream whispering over rocks, but over the last few weeks, something had changed, though I couldn't quite explain how or why. The silence had grown deeper. Heavier. Not empty, but watchful, like the hush inside a cathedral where even the air expects a revelation. I tried telling myself it was simply winter approaching, the kind of atmospheric lull that settles over nature before snow arrives, but the chill that threaded through the early morning breezes felt different, almost deliberate, like the forest breathed in tandem with something unseen, something ancient and aware. It lingered at the back of my mind even as I continued with the familiar tasks of my days, sweeping leaves off the porch, airing out blankets by the windowsill, wandering the worn forest trail to gather herbs the way my mother had taught me before she passed, leaving her knowledge like a map folded neatly into my hands. Life was steady, peaceful, predictable in the way I thought I wanted, yet underneath that calm surface, a quiet restlessness had begun to stir, like soft ripples moving beneath still water. I felt it when the wind shifted suddenly despite no clouds in sight, brushing against the nape of my neck as though someone stood behind me. I felt it when dusk arrived too quickly, shadows stretching long and thin across the ground, reaching farther than they should, as if they were searching. And I felt it most deeply in the evenings, when the sky faded and the forest dimmed, when I would close my windows and latch the door, telling myself the unease tightening in my chest was just imagination. But imagination doesn't create footsteps where no animal walks. It doesn't make the candles flicker without wind. It doesn't cause the air to hold its breath. Someone was watching. I first noticed it on a night when the moon hung low and heavy, glowing like a silver coin pressed against velvet darkness. I had stepped outside to fetch firewood, my thoughts drifting from groceries to the weather to the faint hope that maybe tomorrow I'd feel more grounded, less suspended. As I bent to gather a few logs, the forest behind my cabin exhaled a sound that wasn't a breeze, wasn't an animal, wasn't anything I could name. It was quiet yet resonant, a tone that vibrated through the ground beneath my feet. I froze. The trees stood perfectly still. Not a branch swayed. The chirping that usually filled the night had gone silent so abruptly I felt it like a pressure in my ears. And then I saw it, just for a second, a flicker like a flame catching on wet leaves. A single red glint between the trees. It was not the reflection of my lantern, I knew the difference. This glow pulsed faintly, like an ember breathing in the dark. My heart stumbled, though not in fear, something more like recognition, though I didn't understand how that could be. When I blinked, the glow vanished, swallowed by the shadows, leaving only the echo of a presence that felt too deliberate to dismiss. I waited for the fear to come, but instead, I felt observed. Not hunted, not threatened, simply seen, as though whoever or whatever that red light belonged to had been studying me long before I noticed. I stayed outside longer than I meant to that night, staring into the treeline until the cold finally convinced me to go back inside, though even then I couldn't shake the feeling that something stood just beyond the reach of my lantern's glow, waiting for me to acknowledge it. The next morning, when I stepped outside, the forest looked normal again, almost deceptively so. Birds flitted between branches, sunlight filtered through leaves like scattered gold dust, and the path leading into the woods appeared soft and welcoming, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But I noticed the footprints, large, too large for any regular wolf, pressed into the damp soil just a few feet from my porch. They led toward the trees but didn't continue, as though the creature had stepped there and simply disappeared. I crouched beside them, fingertips hovering above the edges. The tracks were fresh. I brushed them lightly and felt a residual heat, as if whatever left them still lingered nearby. A shiver climbed up my spine. I found myself whispering into the trees, "Who are you?" as though expecting an answer. The forest remained silent, but the air shifted again, sweeping across my cheek in a slow, deliberate caress, almost like a reply. Over the next days, the signs grew more frequent. I'd wake in the night to hear soft crunching of leaves, though when I peered outside, nothing stirred. I'd feel a presence walking just behind me on the trail, but when I turned, the path was empty. And once, while gathering herbs near the northern ridge, I felt a pair of eyes on me so strongly I looked over my shoulder expecting to find a person standing there, but instead saw only the faintest ripple between the shadows, like darkness briefly thickening before dissolving into its normal form. The strange part was that none of this felt malicious. It was unsettling, yes, but not terrifying. More like the world around me was trying to communicate, nudging me gently towards something I didn't yet understand. And through it all, I couldn't forget the single red glint from that first night. Every time I saw something shift between the trees or felt a weight in the silence, I imagined that glowing eye watching me, patient and unblinking. Sometimes, when I walked the forest path at dusk, I caught a silhouette slipping behind a trunk just as I glanced over. Large, wolf-like, but moving in a way no ordinary creature could, a silent, fluid, almost like a shadow studying how to mimic a real animal. And once, I still don't know whether it was real or imagination, I heard a low hum, not quite a growl, more like a vibration in the air, gentle yet resonant, as though someone whispered into the fabric of the forest itself. A whisper directed at me. Still, my life continued in its quiet routine, cooking simple meals, watching the sunrise, tending to the small garden behind my cabin, but each day carried a subtle tension, as though the forest waited for me to notice something important hidden in plain sight. Every morning felt like the moment before a storm breaks, even though the skies remained clear. Every night carried a breathless stillness that felt more like anticipation than peace. I tried telling myself I was overthinking, that isolation can twist perception, but deep down I knew the truth. The forest wasn't just quiet, it was listening. And whatever watched me wasn't accidental. It chose to. I didn't know its name yet, didn't understand its intentions, didn't know that the red eye belonged to a wolf whose legend stretched far beyond the borders of these woods. I didn't know that he carried a destiny intertwined with mine in ways I couldn't imagine. All I knew was that something in the air had shifted, subtle as a heartbeat, profound as a prophecy, and the silence around me was no longer empty. It was waiting. Watching. Preparing. And though I tried to cling to the fragile calm of my ordinary life, I could feel it, the soft, electric hum beneath every breath, every step, every rustle in the trees, whispering that the quiet days I'd always known were drawing to a close, and something ancient and inevitable was beginning to stir. Just beyond the edge of my world, ready to step into it, began to notice the changes slowly at first, subtle enough that I could have brushed them aside as tricks of exhaustion or imagination, yet persistent enough to settle uneasily beneath my skin like the faint ache before a storm. The emotional shifts were the first signs, moments where my heart would suddenly race without reason, where I would pause in the middle of stirring tea or folding laundry because a strange heaviness washed over me, as though an unseen presence had walked through my chest and left its echo behind. At dawn, I felt inexplicably nostalgic, grieving something I couldn't name. By dusk, I felt watched, not in fear, but with an eerie sense of expectation, as though someone already knew the ending of my story and waited for me to catch up. The dreams came next, slipping into my nights with the softness of drifting feathers but lingering with the weight of prophecy. I dreamt of crimson moonlight spilling over empty fields, of towering wolves with eyes like molten gold standing on ridges cloaked in fog, and of a dark silhouette perched silently atop a fallen tree, its single red eye glowing like a warning beacon through the veil of night. Sometimes I wandered through a forest that looked like mine but wasn't, trees twisted into impossible shapes, shadows moving ahead of me rather than behind, and a low hum vibrating through the soil as though the earth itself whispered ancient names I had forgotten. I woke each time with my pulse trembling, unsure whether I had dreamt or remembered something long buried. Even my cabin felt different, doors that creaked with unfamiliar rhythms, floorboards that groaned as if bearing invisible footsteps, the air shifting in the corners of rooms where no breeze should reach. The forest path I walked each day seemed to bend in ways I didn't recognize, leading me to clearings I didn't remember discovering, or to streams that flowed with an unnerving stillness, mirroring the sky with perfect clarity as though waiting for me to see something hidden inside the reflection. It wasn't just me changing, the pack's atmosphere seemed to thicken with unspoken tension. I felt it in the distant howls threading through the night, deeper notes, sharper echoes, the kind that carried meaning rather than instinct. Sometimes the howls came in patterns, almost rhythmic, and I would stand barefoot on my porch, arms wrapped around myself, listening with a tightening throat as though my name hid somewhere within the sound. Even the wolves' presence felt closer. I glimpsed shapes darting between trees at sunrise, too synchronized and deliberate to be random movement. A few times I found feathers arranged on my doorstep in perfect circular patterns, as though placed with intent rather than dropped by passing birds, and once I discovered a line of stones stacked 3 high at the edge of the trail, smooth and cold, and aligned with unnerving precision. It was Kale's presence that grew most unmistakable. What had once been flickers of shadow became full silhouettes lingering just beyond the lantern's glow. At night, when the moon cast silver lines across my porch, I saw him watching from a distance, massive, powerful, his dark fur blending into the night except for that single burning red eye that fixed on me with a focus so sharp it felt like he could see straight into my thoughts. He never moved toward me, never growled, never stirred a leaf around him. He appeared like a living statue carved from shadow, then vanished without sound or trace, leaving only the faintest shift in the wind to prove he had been real. Sometimes he left signs, subtle, cryptic symbols that sent shivers crawling down my spine. Once I returned from gathering herbs to find claw marks etched into the bark of an old oak, not violent slashes, but deliberate marks forming a sweeping curve like the crescent of a moon. Another morning, I found my front door blocked by a single dark feather placed upright in the soil, impossibly balanced despite the breeze. And on a mist-drenched evening, I discovered the imprint of a paw the size of my entire hand pressed into the dirt directly in front of my cabin, its edges glowing faintly with residual warmth, as though Kale had been there only seconds before I arrived. I sensed he was guiding me somewhere, or protecting me from something, but he remained as silent as ever, communicating in symbols rather than words. Each time I felt overwhelmed by the mounting strangeness, the air would shift in a gentle ripple, like a hand brushing my shoulder, and I knew Kale lingered nearby, unseen yet undeniably present. The pack felt it too. Though I lived isolated from them, rumors drifted through the forest like drifting leaves, carried by travelers passing near the woods. They spoke of alphas on edge, of scouts reporting unusual activity along the borders, of a rogue wolf with a glowing red eye sighted near ancient landmarks rumored to hold forgotten prophecies. Once, while collecting water from the stream, I overheard 2 pack members whispering on the opposite bank about strange dreams sweeping through the territory, dreams of fire and moonlight and a woman standing alone beneath a crimson sky. They never saw me, but the way their voices trembled told me they felt the undercurrent too, the same invisible tide pulling at my soul. As days bled into nights, coincidences grew harder to dismiss. A page flew open in one of my old journals to a poem I didn't remember writing about being watched by a wolf with the eye of flame. A silver-hued leaf drifted down from a tree that had no leaves left. A lantern flickered out the moment I whispered Kale's name into the quiet. It felt as though every piece of my life, past, present, inner world, and outer world, was bending toward a single point, guiding me toward a truth I had not yet grasped. My dreams became clearer, sharper, more symbolic. In one, I stood in a circle of ancient stones while a massive dark wolf circled me, stopping only when our eyes met, my reflection seen in his single red eye. In another, I walked through a forest lit by floating embers instead of stars, and at the center, Kale waited, his form neither wolf nor human, but something in between, pointing with a claw toward a distant mountain wrapped in storm clouds. I awoke drenched in a feeling that was neither fear nor comfort, but something deeper, recognition. As if I had been somewhere I was meant to return to. The more I tried to ignore the signs, the more the world seemed to correct me. Birds flew in arcs above me that resembled runic shapes I'd seen in old books. The stream's surface rippled once, forming the outline of what looked like a wolf's head before dissolving. The wind seemed to whisper through the branches, tugging me toward the deeper parts of the forest I always avoided. And every time I wavered, every time uncertainty made my breath shorten, that red I would appear again, watching, guiding, insisting without words that I follow the trail fate laid before me. One evening, as twilight bled into darkness and the last colors drained from the sky, I stepped outside to breathe the cool night air, hoping the fresh calm would settle my restless mind. The forest waited in absolute stillness, the silence so complete it felt like a wall pressing gently against me. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my thoughts, but the wind curled around me like a whisper, carrying a faint hum that resonated deep in my bones. I opened my eyes slowly, and froze. At the edge of the forest stood Kale. Not hidden. Not shadowed. Not fleeting. Fully present, illuminated by the soft glow of the rising moon. His fur looked like living darkness, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it, and his massive form radiated an aura both powerful and ancient. His red eye burned steadily, not with malice, but with purpose. He didn't move. He didn't blink. Yet I felt him speak, not through sound, but through something deeper, a silent command thrumming through the air, urging me to listen, to understand, to follow. The wind shifted sharply, swirling around my feet like a warning. The trees trembled though no breeze had touched them. The world felt suspended, as if everything, every breath, every heartbeat, every secret, had gathered for this moment. And then I realized it, I wasn't merely being watched. I was being guided. Guided toward a path I could no longer pretend wasn't there, a path carved by forces far older and wiser than me, a path where Kale stood as both guardian and herald. My life hadn't changed by accident. Something had chosen me. And whatever it was getting closer. For days the world felt like it was tightening around me, drawing invisible borders that I couldn't yet define, and though I walked the same familiar paths, breathed the same forest air, and touched the same worn wood of my cabin walls, nothing felt the same anymore, as if reality itself had begun to warp around the edges in preparation for something, or someone, I had not yet met but somehow already sensed, like a pulse in the earth calling out to a matching rhythm inside me, faint and distant but steadily growing stronger. The nights deepened first, stretching longer than they should, each hour thick with anticipation that pressed against my skin like warm breath just behind my ear, and I realized the darkness was changing. No longer an empty blanket draped over the world but a living thing with texture and movement and intention. I could feel it when I stepped outside each evening, the air shifting around me in a subtle spiral as though greeting me, and the forest responding with cautious awareness, its silence laced with tension that felt both warning and welcome. My dreams sharpened, the imagery painfully vivid, a towering figure standing on a cliff, backlit by a burning moon, a hand reaching through darkness toward me, a wolf with a red eye and a human silhouette overlapping its form like two beings inhabiting the same body. In every dream, a single message pulsed beneath my feet like a heartbeat through the ground, someone is coming. And though I didn't know who, the moment I felt his presence, I understood the dreams weren't imagination, weren't fear, weren't fragments of my subconscious trying to soothe or torment me. They were warnings. Invitations. Prophecies. Everything began the night the wind refused to behave, when it twisted around my cabin in spirals, whispering with low, reverberating tones that resonated so deeply it felt like my bones were answering back. I stepped outside, breath trembling, and the forest greeted me with a stillness so absolute it felt unnatural, the kind of silence that exists only when the world braces for something monumental. Then it happened, a sound so soft it could have been mistaken for a sigh, yet heavy enough to tilt the world, footsteps. Not the stealthy movements of wolves or the cautious tread of deer. No. These steps carried weight, authority, and an unmistakable rhythm, each one sending a shiver up my spine. I didn't move at first, I simply watched as the darkness parted like a curtain being drawn aside, revealing a figure emerging from its depths. He stepped forward slowly, as though giving me time to breathe him into existence, tall, impossibly tall, shoulders broad enough to command the space around him, and with an aura so intense the air itself bent around his presence. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, not quite human, not quite wolf, but something tethered between worlds, blending power with prophecy in a way that made the forest bow around him. He wasn't feral or monstrous, he was controlled, composed, dangerous only in the way storms are dangerous, natural, inevitable, breathtaking in magnitude. I knew instantly that he was no ordinary wolf shifter, no simple alpha. Something in my chest answered him, a silent recognition that didn't belong to memory but to fate. The moment he stepped into the moonlight, the shadows behind him rippled, and Kale appeared, massive and formidable, emerging from the darkness like a guardian carved out of the night. His red eye burned fiercely, pulsing in a slow rhythm that felt like a warning and an oath combined. The mysterious figure didn't glance at him, didn't need to. Their energies intertwined in the air, communicating in a way beyond language, not allies, not enemies, but something far more complex. Kale moved first, stepping between us with silent grace, his presence both protective and commanding. He turned his head toward me, his single crimson eye locking with mine, and for the first time since I had seen him, he spoke, not with sound, not with breath, but with a voice that resonated directly inside my mind like a soft thunder. Your world stands on a lie. The words cracked through my chest like a fault line splitting open. Then Kale shifted his gaze to the figure behind him as though daring him to refute it, but the man only watched me with an expression I couldn't decipher, soft, solemn, infinitely knowing. I wanted to speak, to demand explanations, but my throat felt sealed shut, my mind struggling to process the weight of Kale's message. My world stands on a lie? Which part? My memories? My identity? The peaceful solitude I believed I'd chosen? The figure stepped closer, his movements fluid and controlled, each step sending another ripple through the air. I felt the pull of him instantly, magnetic, powerful, ancient in a way that made my pulse stutter with awe rather than fear. When he finally stood a few feet from me, the world seemed to bend around us, the trees leaning inward as though eager witnesses to the moment. You feel it, don't you? He said, voice deep and resonant, carrying the weight of someone who had lived through countless winters. The shift. The calling. The truth pressing against the edges of your life. I swallowed hard. Who are you? His lips curved, barely a smile, more an acknowledgement of a question he'd been expecting. The one fate has been weaving toward you, he said softly, though not the one who will shape your destiny alone. His gaze flicked briefly to Kale, who huffed quietly, the sound vibrating through the ground. He's been guarding the lie, the man continued, until you were ready to see through it. My skin prickled. The air felt too thin. What lie? I whispered. He looked at me with an intensity that made the world hush. The lie about who you are. My heart lurched, beating so hard it felt like it might bruise my ribs from the inside. Before I could ask more, the wind rose sharply, swirling between us in a sudden gust that carried the scent of something ancient, earth, moonlight, power. Kale stepped closer to me, his enormous form radiating tension, his red eye burning brighter than ever. The magnetic figure didn't move to threaten him, instead, he lowered his head in a gesture that was almost, unthinkably, respect. It was the kind of moment that felt like a hinge in time, something shifting irreversibly beneath the surface. You were hidden for a reason, he said gently. Protected. Sheltered. Veiled. But not from danger, from destiny. A cold shiver wrapped around my spine, not from fear but from the eruption of truth brushing too close to consciousness, and the strange, growing certainty that whatever I had believed about my life, my simple existence, my ordinary place in the world, had been constructed with careful hands, woven like a veil meant to keep me unaware of my own reflection. The man's voice softened, but the weight of it was heavier than ever. Your life didn't begin the day you remember, he murmured. It began the day it was hidden. I felt the ground tilt. The trees around me blurred. The wind hummed with a frequency that matched the rising panic, or recognition, in my chest. Kale's voice echoed again across my thoughts, lower this time, a whisper carved into the air like a blade through fog. See the truth. I stared at the figure before me, the powerful being whose presence felt like the missing half of a story I didn't know I'd lost, and the world seemed to shift around him, not physically, but in meaning, like he wasn't entering my life, but returning to it. And in that moment, with Kale's words vibrating through my bones and the stranger's eyes burning with truths I wasn't ready to hear, one core belief inside me cracked open and shattered, the belief that my life had ever truly belonged to me. I woke before dawn, though I couldn't remember falling asleep, my breathing uneven as if I had been running through worlds rather than dreaming, and as the early light crept across my walls, I realized my hands were trembling, stained with a faint shimmer I didn't recognize, silver dust, soft as moonlight and warm as a fading memory, as though I had touched something sacred in the night and brought a piece of it back with me. Yet the more I tried to remember the dream, the more it slipped into smoke, dissolving into forgotten corners of my mind until only fragments remained, whispered warnings, blurred faces, the echo of distant paws on ancient earth, and the haunting sensation that someone had called my name with a voice older than the forest itself. All morning, the world felt slightly misaligned, as if my senses were tuned to a frequency I wasn't supposed to hear. Wind moved against its natural direction, carrying the strong, metallic scent of storms even though the sky was perfectly clear. The trees seemed to lean inward whenever I passed, their branches bending in subtle arcs as if bowing toward me, and the air shimmered in strange pulses that made me blink hard, wondering whether I was seeing reality or the remnants of my dreams bleeding through. Every step I took felt heavier, tethered to unseen threads pulling me towards secrets I had never known I was meant to uncover, and whenever the pack members spoke near me, their voices sounded hollow, distant, almost rehearsed, like lines in a forgotten tale that had been told too many times, yet never truthfully. The elders watched me with an intensity one hadn't seen before, their expressions unreadable, their silences longer than they should have been, and whenever I asked questions about our origins or the old rites, they deflected with polite words that felt too smooth, too practiced, smoothing over truths that suddenly felt urgent, fragile, forbidden. My heart pounded with a quiet certainty that something had been hidden from me, not just a detail, not just a story, but something foundational, something that shaped every part of the world I thought I understood, and as the hours drifted by, my skin prickled with the sensation that I was standing on the threshold of something immense, something waiting to swallow or free me depending on what I chose to see. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, flashes of imagery struck me, wolves running beneath a blood-red moon, an ancient tree splitting open to reveal a glowing core, shadows gathering in the shape of a crown, and a voice, perhaps my own, whispering, "It was never supposed to be this way." When sleep finally claimed me, it wasn't rest but a plunge into visions so vivid they felt like memories long denied. A council of long-gone alphas gathered in a circle of stone, arguing in low growls about destiny and sacrifice. A child, my child self, being carried through the forest under a cloak of moonlight, a symbol engraved into the earth that pulsed with red light, the same shade as Kale's left eye, the mark glowing like a heartbeat as if calling me home. I saw the pack not as it was now, but as it had been centuries ago, bound to a prophecy, chained to a secret pact made out of fear rather than wisdom, and in the center of it all was a wolf whose identity was blurred, obscured, erased from the story on purpose, as though someone had cut him from history with deliberate precision. I woke gasping, tears on my face though I didn't know why, my chest tight with grief for someone I couldn't remember but knew I had lost. The world outside my window was unnervingly still, no wind, no birds, no rustle of leaves, and when I stepped outside, the forest felt watchful, holding its breath as though waiting for me to see something I had ignored for far too long. That was when I felt it, a presence behind me, silent but unmistakable, and when I turned, Kale stood at the edge of the treeline, his dark, massive form half hidden in shadows, his glowing red left eye the only point of light in the dimness. He didn't step closer, didn't speak at first, but his gaze felt like an entire history unfolding and collapsing at once, and my heart tightened with the sudden understanding that he had been guarding me long before I knew he existed. The ground beneath him shimmered faintly, the soil shifting to form a spiraling pattern that matched the symbol from my visions, and though he made no sound, I knew, deep in my bones, that he wanted me to see it, to recognize it, to remember. My breath hitched as flashes of memory surged again, me, as a child, clutching the fur of a wolf with one glowing red eye, crying into his coat while an elder whispered, "She must never know." My knees weakened as a realization slammed into me. Kale had been part of my life long before adulthood, long before I became Luna, long before I even knew what the word destiny meant. For the first time, Kale stepped forward, his paws silent, his presence vast and steady, and he lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but in something like acknowledgement, as though confirming a truth I had only just begun to remember. The air around us vibrated, as if the world itself were listening, and though his mouth did not move, a message pressed against my mind, not words but meaning. "You knew this once." My heartbeat thundered in my ears. The stories I had been taught about our origins flickered and cracked, the lies unraveling like old thread, until one truth emerged from the ruins. The pack's history wasn't one of noble leadership and destined hierarchy, it was one built on a mistake, a prophecy twisted to serve fear instead of balance, and I, unknowingly, had been placed at the center of it since birth. I felt the weight of it crash over me, an immense tidal wave of understanding that reshaped everything. My role, my power, my past, and the forest around me seemed to pulse with a new rhythm, branches trembling as if welcoming the truth back into the world. Kale held my gaze one moment longer, his red eye blazing with something fierce and ancient, then stepped backward, fading once more into the shadows, leaving me alone with the symbol etched into the earth and the echo of a destiny that had been silently waiting for me to awaken. I stood there, trembling but unbroken, realizing with a clarity that chilled and steadied me at once, everything I believed about my life, my pack, and my purpose had been shaped by stories that were never meant to protect me, but to control the prophecy I had just uncovered, and now that the truth was awake inside me, nothing would ever be the same again. Spent the rest of that day moving through the world as though I were walking inside a storm no one else could see, each inhale heavy with questions that scraped at my chest and each exhale trembling with truths I no longer had the strength to deny. The revelation of the pack's twisted history pulsed inside me like a second heartbeat, sharp and insistent, and every time someone spoke my name, I heard beneath their tone the weight of centuries, lies crafted before I was born, loyalties formed not out of devotion but out of fear of what I was meant to become. As I walked through the village, I felt the subtle shift in how the others looked at me, too carefully, too knowingly, as if some instinct warned them that something within me had awakened, something they could not control, something they had been told to dread even while pretending to love me. My own emotions twisted like roots beneath the soil, tangled between grief for the innocence I had lost and anger for the truths stolen from me, and though part of me wanted to confront the elders, demand answers, tear away the veil of secrecy they had draped over my childhood, another part of me trembled with the understanding that knowledge once uncovered could never be returned to the earth as quietly as before. Conversations slipped around me in half-whispers. Packmates who once met my gaze with warm familiarity now looked away too quickly, their shadows pulling tight around them as though sensing the storm swirling inside my soul, and I felt a bruise forming in my heart, a deep ache that came from realizing trust could fracture without a single harsh word spoken. Even the air felt different, denser, charged, humming with something that seemed to press against my skin, urging me to choose a path I could not yet see, and every time the wind brushed against my hair, I felt it like a ghost of encouragement, soft but insistent. By evening, the world shimmered at the edges of my vision, my senses heightened, my emotions raw, and in the thick of that overwhelming intensity, I felt him before I saw him, Kale, the silent storm behind the storm, the shadow that had followed me long before I ever knew to look for him. His presence thrummed through the trees like an ancient drumbeat, steady, watchful, protective, and when I finally turned toward the forest, I caught the faint glow of his red left eye between the branches, brighter than before, as though he had stepped closer not just physically but within the unseen threads that bound us. I should have been afraid, a giant wolf hidden in the darkness, watching me with a gaze that burned like molten dusk, but instead, I felt a strange, aching comfort, as if the world finally acknowledged my turmoil instead of pretending it wasn't there. The bond was not spoken, not declared, yet it pulsed between us like a shared breath, and in that moment, I felt the overwhelming urge to step toward him, to ask him why he had always been there, why he guarded me from shadows rather than standing in the light beside me. But before I could form a single word, a group of pack members emerged from the other side of the clearing, their footsteps stiff, their postures rigid in a way that made my intuition claw at my ribs. They approached with the politeness of duty, but their expressions carried the tight worry of people walking through a prophecy they wished they could avoid, and when they told me the elders had summoned me for a private clarification, something inside me recoiled, not because of the request, but because I could hear, beneath their carefully chosen words, the tremor of fear that did not belong to me. I followed them nonetheless, the weight of Cale's unseen gaze anchoring me with silent reassurance, but my thoughts raced faster with every step, each one echoing with doubt. Could I trust the elders after everything I had discovered, or were they simply tightening the strings they believed still held me in place? When we reached the council hall, dusk had settled into a deep blue haze, shadows gathering like spectators along the walls, and the elders stood in a half-circle, their expressions warm but strained, as if they were holding back truths even now. They asked about my dreams, my visions, my emotions, but the way they exchanged glances told me they weren't seeking understanding. They were measuring me, assessing how much I had uncovered, and deciding how much control they still had over the narrative. Every instinct inside me rebelled. I answered carefully, my voice steady even as my heart pounded like thunder, and with each question, a thread of trust that once tied me to them snapped silently, until I realized with a dull, haunting ache that the people who had raised me with gentle smiles had also built the walls that kept me from my own destiny. When they dismissed me, pretending nothing had changed, I stepped out into the chilled night with a weight so heavy it forced tears to the edges of my eyes, but before they fell, I felt that familiar presence again, a soft vibration in the earth, a shift in the shadows, and Cale emerged partially from the forest, closer than ever, his massive silhouette outlined by moonlight, his glowing red eye reflecting the pain I had tried to hide. I felt his reassurance like a whisper against my mind, not words, but meaning, a sense of steady certainty that I was not losing my world, only shedding the part of it that was never real. But even that comfort could not fix what was unraveling inside me. Because trust was not the only bond straining, my closest companion, the one who had stood by me since childhood, found me minutes later, his expression marked with fear, not for me, but of me. When he asked what the elders had said, and I hesitated, unsure whether the truth would shatter him too, his voice broke with a softness that pierced me. You're changing, and I don't know how to follow you. The words struck harder than any prophecy ever could, because they came from someone whose loyalty had once been my anchor, and now, that anchor slipped from my grip. I tried to explain gently, carefully, that I didn't want distance, that I wasn't becoming someone dangerous, only someone aware, someone awakening to a fate larger than childhood promises, but the more I spoke, the more his eyes dimmed with the quiet grief of someone watching a bond stretch beyond reach. When he stepped back, the night swallowed the space between us, and though no harsh words were spoken, the separation felt like a blade made of silence, sharp enough to split the past from the present. Tears finally escaped, sliding hot down my cheeks, and I turned away so he wouldn't see, but Cale saw, Cale always saw, and when I glanced toward the forest, he lowered his head, not in sorrow but in recognition of the sacrifice I had just made. To walk forward, I had to let go of the person who could not walk with me. As the wind picked up, rustling leaves in a mournful chorus, I felt the full weight of destiny pressing against my spine, cold and unyielding, and though Cale remained hidden in the shadows, I sensed him step even closer, his presence brushing against me like a ghost of strength, as if to say that the path ahead might demand more losses, more choices, more storms, but I would not face them alone. And with that silent promise lingering between us, I let out a trembling breath, realizing that tonight I had lost something precious, something irreplaceable, and yet, for the first time, I also felt the faint, terrifying beginnings of who I was truly meant to become. The night after the storm in my heart broke open felt unnaturally calm, as if the world had paused to witness whether I would rise or crumble beneath the weight of everything I had learned. And though my body trembled with exhaustion, physical, emotional, spiritual, I sensed something else beneath it all, a quiet strength unfurling inside me like roots finally breaking through stone, claiming the earth that always belonged to them. Every breath I drew carried the echo of ancient truths, and with each inhale, I felt less like the uncertain girl shaped by half-told stories and more like the woman destiny had been calling toward the entire time, the Luna I was meant to become before fear rewrote my path. The pack slept in uneasy silence, shadows clinging to the edges of cabins and rooftops as if afraid to move beneath the pulsing moonlight, and though no one said it aloud, I knew some instinct deep within them sensed the shift, the awakening, the unraveling of old lies and the forming of something new, something raw and far greater than the comfort of the stories they had been told. I walked alone through the village, feeling the cold dew on the ground and hearing the faint whisper of leaves that rustled not with wind, but with recognition. The forest had always watched me, but tonight it seemed to breathe with me, accepting me, greeting me, opening paths I had never noticed before. With each step into the treeline, the weight of sorrow for what I had lost mingled with the fierce, growing certainty that letting go was not just a pain but a right, a passage into truth I could not avoid, a doorway only I could cross. The air vibrated as soon as I entered the deeper thickets, carrying the scent of damp earth, moonlit bark, and something sharp and electric that felt like a memory waiting to materialize. And then, without warning, I felt him, Kale, not simply as a presence at the edge of vision but as a force that surged through the shadows themselves. His glowing red eye appeared first between the ancient pines, a single ember burning in the darkness, steady and unblinking, holding the weight of centuries in its silent gaze. When he stepped into view, larger than any wolf in living memory, his dark fur catching slivers of silver light like an armor forged from night itself, I felt my breath seize in my chest. This time, there was no fear, no hesitation. Instead, something deep within me responded, a recognition so profound it made my heartbeat falter and then steady with newfound clarity. Kale approached with silent steps, his enormous form moving like a whisper of fate across the forest floor, and though he remained a creature carved out of mystery, something about the way he lowered his head in my direction told me he was offering not dominance or protection, but acknowledgement, of truth, of destiny, of the path I had finally accepted. I didn't need him to speak for meaning to bloom inside me. He had been there since the beginning, watching when I couldn't see, guarding when I didn't know to fear, guiding me through the labyrinth of deception the pack built around me. He had carried the pieces of the prophecy, not as a burden but as a vow. And now, I understood why he always remained in the shadows. It was not because he feared the light, but because he had been waiting for me to step into it. My pulse thrummed gently in my ears as he moved closer, each step deliberate, powerful, grounded in a history I still only understood in fragments, and when he stopped before me, his red eye blazed with an emotion I could not fully name, pride, sorrow, warning, hope, perhaps all at once. For a moment, the forest around us stilled, as though time held its breath, and the soft thrum of energy in the air thickened until it felt like I stood in the center of a sacred circle layered across generations. I opened my mouth, not sure what I meant to say, what question my heart was ready to ask, but before a single word escaped, Kale tilted his massive head and pressed his forehead gently against mine, a touch so soft it shattered me more completely than any revelation before it. In that contact, something passed between us, not a vision, not a memory, but a resonance, a silent confirmation that my awakening was not the end of a story but the beginning of one far older and far more dangerous. My breath trembled as he slowly stepped back, and when our connection broke, I felt both bereft and whole, as though a vital chapter had reached its final line while another, equally vital, waited just off the page. Kale's gaze shifted upward toward the faint edge of dawn peeking between the trees, and as the first pale hint of sunlight touched his fur, he turned away from me, his posture changing, not in fear, not in reluctance, but in the solemn certainty of someone completing a vow. His paws moved without sound as he approached a clearing I had never noticed before, its ground marked by a formation of stones arranged in a spiral that mirrored the symbol from my visions. When he stepped into its center, the stones glowed faintly, responding to a magic older than the pack itself, and Kale lifted his head toward the sky with a stillness that made the world hush around him. Then, in a gesture both simple and impossible, he placed a single dark feather at the center of the glowing symbol, where it shimmered with a red pulse that matched the hue of his eye. The meaning struck me all at once, sending a tremor through my bones. This was not just a farewell, but a seal, a sign, a final message left for the future. The feather dimmed slowly, its glow softening into a warmth that spread across the earth like the final heartbeat of a legend. Cale looked back at me one last time, his red eye flickering with an emotion I would spend the rest of my life trying to translate, and in that quiet exchange, I felt words without sound, "You are ready now." And then, without fanfare, without sound, he stepped backward into the forest, his form sinking into shadow, dissolving into the dark as though he had never been made of flesh and fur but smoke and prophecy. I took a step forward instinctively, aching to follow, to ask him to stay, to say that I wasn't ready to lose him just as I finally understood him, but my feet froze as the trees closed subtly around his path, sealing the way with a reverence that felt absolute. My vision blurred with tears, but they were not born purely of grief. Woven into them was gratitude, awe, and the quiet certainty that Cale's disappearance was not abandonment, but fulfillment. The forest exhaled around me, a soft release of energy that brushed against my skin, and as the first rays of sunrise broke over the horizon, painting the treetops in gold and rose, the world shifted once more. A distant howl rose through the morning air, low, haunting, achingly familiar, a sound that carried both a farewell and an eternal promise, echoing across the valley with a resonance that made my heart tremble. As the howl faded, a faint red glow flickered between the trees, pulsing softly like the final beat of a dying star, until it dimmed into silence, leaving only the rustling of leaves and the soft warmth of dawn. I stood there, the sunlight touching my face, knowing Cale's legend would live on in every shadow, every whisper of wind, every shiver of destiny that brushed the world in quiet moments, and that this was not the end of his story, nor mine, but merely the closing of the first chapter in a tale far grander than either of us had ever been allowed to know.